Except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we transition to the world of basketball, specifically the NBA, to preview an intriguing matchup in the Eastern Conference between two kind of fringe contenders, one more so than the other, Knicks Pacers. And the reason I wanted to highlight this game specifically, amidst all the trade deadline noise where both of these teams kind of stood pat, is because it has a completely different tenor to their very hyped up playoff series just a couple of months ago, really. Both of these teams in drastically different places, where the Knicks feel like they're a team that could compete for the Eastern Conference, and the Pacers feel like they still have the talent to, but aren't necessarily living up to the standards they set for themselves. So in this matchup, with both teams feeling like they can still contend, but one actually proving it more than the other, I feel like this game is come under a little bit more heavy scrutiny, even though it's lost its luster a little bit, this rivalry. So let's start off by talking about how these teams come into these couple of games. The Knicks right now potentially seen as, well, not necessarily after that embarrassing loss at home to Boston a couple of nights ago, seen as one of the hottest teams in the NBA. That loss aside, I believe they had won 8 straight games. Jalen Brunson, Karl-Anthony Towns really in their bag, playing hyper-efficient basketball the Tom Thibodeau way, and really looking like a team that could make some noise in the Eastern Conference. Whereas this Pacers team kind of has stumbled over the past couple of weeks. They're 2-2 in their last 4 games. And to prove to you the volatility of this 2025 iteration of the Indiana Pacers, they trailed by 15 or more in all 4 games, and 20 or more in the last 3. And several of those games were comebacks, actually. A lot of the time, the Pacers had the offensive talent to keep these games and split their past 4. But ultimately, it's their defense that's been letting them down. That's always been the case with this Pacers team. They're 21st in defensive rating, and going up against this Knicks offense that, yes, lacks depth, but still, you might say, is the best starting 5 potentially in the entire NBA. I don't necessarily like the look of this compared to last year, when your offense could just about outscore anybody and really made that series a series. And the reason why it went 7 games, because those guys in that starting 5, the Tyrese Halliburtons of the world, the Pascal Siakams of the world, the TJ McConnells of the world, refused to lose that series. But now the tables have turned. And even though this season they split the first 2 meetings, and the Pacers get this one at home. It's their final home game, in fact, before the All-Star break. I do feel like the Knicks have more momentum. Yes, they got knocked back a little bit. They got a bit of a reality check at home, in fact, against the Boston Celtics. And it's the second time this season where the Boston Celtics have really had their way with this Knicks team. And it's going to be called into question whether or not this Knicks team truly has what it takes to take the Eastern Conference this year and have their championship window be open for a certain period of time over the next 5 or so years. But ultimately, they're still only 2.5 back of Boston. They're 4.5 ahead of the Pacers. So in a spot where they feel like they're reaching new horizons. Now, the reason I bring up last year's series is because that series was a defining rivalry, and it really brought both of these teams into the forefront, right? And it really promised, most importantly, 2 teams that would not let this Eastern Conference stagnate and become, say, the Boston Celtics conference to have for the next number of years. And right now, while it could remain that way because both these teams are very likely to go into the postseason with very high hopes potentially of making a run at this thing, it's not like last year where you felt that both of these teams could have stood a chance against Boston, but ultimately didn't have enough. It's more so like the Eastern Conference is so crowded that I really don't know how to define these two teams as contenders. I feel like the New York Knicks stand a chance in this year's Eastern Conference, but when I look around at the depth of it, it's really puzzling to discern whether or not they actually can. And the Pacers right now have regressed so much that I really can't say the starting five is good enough to carry them like they did last year. And so I'm looking at a game like this, going, this could have been a very important and pivotal game before the All-Star break. And it technically is, right? The Knicks want to stay within touching distance of Boston in second, and the Pacers still want to make some noise, not just in the playoff race, not just in the Eastern Conference, but to ensure that they remain firmly in, at the very least, the play-in spots. But right now, I feel like this game is more so meaningless because of the fact that no matter how these teams profile against each other, is the rest of the Eastern Conference they should be worrying about. And especially two teams that feel like they could have stood pat at the trade deadline and weren't necessarily aggressive enough. For example, if I'm the Knicks, I feel like I need more depth, especially, in my opinion, defensively for the non-Towns minutes ahead. Because Towns really, even though a lot of people are saying that he doesn't necessarily have to carry the Knicks as much as people initially thought, he still has to remain hyper efficient whenever he's out there because they really don't necessarily have the depth at the center position to compensate for when he's off the court. And then you look at a guy like Jalen Brunson, who's the ultimate heartbeat of this team, and how he really has no backup options. You're looking at guys on this depth chart like Pacom Dadier, like Jericho Sims, like Landry Shamet, who might have to be called into question come postseason. That's not something, if you're the Knicks, you really want. But you're firmly relying upon the stars you do have, the moves you did make in the offseason, where you fully bought into this Tom Thibodeau identity and you're relying on these stars to play 40 plus minutes a night. And they're highly capable of doing it, right? But to what extent does it hurt your chances in the Eastern Conference? And so that's why I feel like this game for the Knicks is very questionable in my mind. Because I do feel like they'll win it, but I feel like the importance of it's going to be lost on them because of the fact that they didn't necessarily address some issues in the trade situation where the trade deadline situation, rather, where they could have bolstered their depth. But really, they are starting to become, at the very least, a team that has an identity. We're going to go out there with our starting five. We're going to play 40 minutes. We're going to play a tough, physical 40 minutes at that. And hopefully that's going to be enough to where our backups can't hurt us and our lack of depth can't hurt us. So it's a very interesting approach. And for now, it's working. But against teams in the Eastern Conference that really can shock you, I don't know how this Knicks team holds up. And then when I look at the Pacers, this team really is a fringe contender now, and they could be on the outside looking in at contender status come postseason time. Not saying that they're not going to make the postseason. They'll at least make the play-in, in my opinion. But for now, they're constantly, in my mind, a team that is plummeting down the tier list. And we'll talk about the tiers of contention next week in the NBA. But I feel like if you're the Indiana Pacers, you can't necessarily feel like this team's infrastructure right now is good enough in this highly competitive Eastern Conference. They're a team that I feel is slightly similar to the Knicks' philosophies and have skewed them a little as of late, but they're not pulling it off as effectively as, say, the Knicks are. I do feel like this is a team, right, where they can get rolling at any time, but Tyrese Halliburton has regressed. Pascal Siakam has too much pressure on him to deliver when Tyrese Halliburton is not effective. And guys like Nembhard and McConnell have clearly declined in their efficiency for this team. And I feel like, a lot of Pacers fans might be saying, well, this team is made for the playoffs, and it's the reason why they profiled so well last year. I don't necessarily see it this year, because this team is not like last year's team where they at least played decently enough defensively to where the offense could outscore the opposition. It's more so now hope that you don't get 130 put up on you and you don't score that much. It's more of playing catch up to where this Pacers team before did just enough offensively to win games to now where they're having to play catch up and as a result splitting more games they should be winning. So when these two teams face off against each other tonight, it's going to have a much different meaning, and it's not necessarily, in my opinion, going to be as important to their playoff hopes or tell us anything new about these teams. But what I will be looking for in tonight's matchup is which of these teams' philosophies is more likely to stick and most likely to actually mean something in the next 3 to 5 years. Because both of these teams have the blueprint set out for them. Potentially the Knicks more so than the Pacers right now. But if the Eastern Conference continues to get better, how will these teams find themselves 3 to 5 years down the road? And I feel like right now, them standing pat the trade-in line says a lot about how they feel. But if you're a Knicks or Pacers fan, chime in. I definitely want to hear from you most of all about tonight's game and about how both of these teams could profile heading into the postseason. But coming next, we're talking some college hoops here. Starting to get into bubble watch territory, guys. Starting off with potentially the top heaviest of conferences, the SEC, and who to look out for over the next couple of months. Be right back after this short break.
For the best